When we look back at the disappointing season the Bulls had last year and the lack of moves that were made over last offseason, standing pat at the trade deadline and also the pretty uninspiring press conferences throughout the year from the Bulls front office, and going into this offseason, for the most part, Bulls fans anyway, we had pretty low expectations on what the Bulls would do as far as making meaningful moves to improve the roster. And while I'm sure some will say I'm hyping up what have been otherwise pretty underwhelming moves from the Bulls, this has actually been quietly an impressive offseason thus far for them, given the circumstances, limitations they had to work with. Some of that, of course, self-imposed, because they could always just go into the luxury tax and use all the exceptions they have at their disposal, but we know that that's not going to happen. And when you're already an over-the-cap team and you're limited by the tax, there are so many ways for which you can improve the roster, if not blowing it up and overhauling the lineup. So while most will say this is a pretty meh offseason and why are we getting excited about it, well, let's dive into it a bit further and I'll explain why. So what's going on, everyone? You're listening to Bulls Central here. Hope you're all doing well. First of all, a big happy 4th of July to you all. Hope you're all enjoying your day off, getting some barbecues going and spending time with family and friends. I'm about to head out to one myself and hopefully we won't have any breaking news about the Bulls while I'm there. But in any event, pending any potential breaking news coming in today, let's talk about the Bulls offseason so far and why this has kind of been a sneaky good offseason. Now, here's the thing. I do think it's important to include context when thinking about the last offseason for the Bulls that they had at the end of the 21-22 season. The Bulls' needs then were still the same as the needs are now. They needed shooting, they needed a reliable point guard, a true point guard to fill in for Lonzo Ball, though at that time the expectation was that he was going to be coming back. And then they needed some bigger bodies, wing defenders, and rim protection. And what did the Bulls do to address those needs? They signed Andre Drummond and Goran Dragic. Really not solving the Bulls' needs whatsoever, especially as it relates to shooting and rim protection. And like the previous offseason, but even more apparent in this desperate need for this upcoming year, the Bulls had to address shooting as their #1 priority. And again, addressing these needs assuming the continuity route, which we knew was always going to be the case. Like, yeah, it probably would have been the best to just rebuild the roster or at least have some major shakeup between moving on from one of the big three. But at the end of the day, we knew this front office was going to cling to this roster that they built and not admitting defeat. So I'm saying all this as an additional caveat when I say that it's actually been a decent offseason thus far. Decent from the perspective of running it back while working on the margins and focusing on areas of need. So first, the Bulls re-signed Vucevic. I've already made a couple videos discussing this. Say what you will about the signing. It was an overpay. Bulls were doing it to save face because of the trade that they made for Vucevic. They were bidding against themselves. Whatever. You can say what you want. The fact of the matter is Vucevic at $20 million a year for a starting caliber center, and a center that is still a double-double machine, can play make and space the floor. You compare that to the rest of the market and what some of these other players are getting around the NBA. It's fair value for Vucevic. Yeah, 3 years to have it be fully guaranteed is a bit of a stretch, but when you also consider the fact that the salary cap has continued to go up, $20 million a year, especially 3 years from now, is going to be slightly higher than the mid-level salary. So I know a lot of people are harping on Vucevic and that signing, but if you don't bring Vuce back, you have a gaping hole at center, and you wouldn't have the requisite money to sign another center at his caliber, given the Bulls would still have been over the cap, and the max they could have paid another center on the free agent market would have been at the full mid-level exception. And then you just used your entire mid-level exception, which doesn't enable you to sign other free agents to fill out the rest of the roster. So extending Vucevic had to be done. Maybe a slight overpay, with 3 years being fully guaranteed, but re-signing Vuce was the best course of action rather than letting him walk for nothing. And the good thing is, it's not a gross overpay of a contract for his production to where that contract is now going to be untradeable. They can always trade Vuce down the line if needed. Second, the Bulls re-signed Coby White to an extremely team-friendly deal, 3 years at $33 million. I know it's technically up to $40 million with incentives, but I'm going to go based off of what's guaranteed. And Coby White at an average salary of $11 million, which is below the mid-level exception and will only get better over time as the salary cap increases, was such a bargain deal, especially when most figured Coby was going to be getting somewhere closer to the $14 million range. By getting Coby at a cheaper deal, it enabled the Bulls a little more flexibility to sign other players while remaining under the tax. Guys like Jevon Carter, who I've said before, might possibly be the most underrated signing of the offseason for the price tag they got him at 3 years, $20 million. And for a player who addresses multiple needs on the roster, the Bulls needed shooting. Carter solves that, shot over 42% from 3 on over 4 attempts per game. It's not the highest volume, but expect that volume to go up on the Bulls, who need more guys to shoot threes and not be afraid to do so. Carter is limited in his ability to get to the basket. We all know that. He's not going to have the best handles when it comes to driving through the paint, but think of it like Lonzo Ball, a catch and shoot three-point shooter who is a hustle, a lockdown defender. I'm not saying he's as good as Lonzo, far from it, but similar in the sense that they are not as crafty with the dribble drive penetration and finishing at the rim, but he can space the floor, knock down threes, and play strong defense. Carter's only 27 as well. Well, he'll be 28 by the time the season starts. So you're getting a guy in his prime and is coming off one of his best seasons and starting 39 games for a team that finished with the best record in the league. Getting him at just over $6 million is a steal, and I was shocked to see the Bulls actually get him for that cheap. Then, of course, more recently you had the Bulls signing Torrey Craig, this one for a vet minimum deal. This one surprised me because when it was announced that the Bulls signed Craig to a 2-year deal, they didn't immediately share what the amount was, and I thought, well, there's no way this is for the minimum. Why would Craig sign with the Bulls for the vet min when he could easily get that from other contenders? It has to be for more than the vet minimum, perhaps the biannual exception of around $4 million. But sure enough, the Bulls were able to snag Torrey Craig for the vet min for 2 years. The 2 years with the player option is probably what did it, and having him sign with the Bulls over, say, another team that might have been only willing to give him a 1-year deal. But look, Torrey Craig, another hustler, another guy that is going to give you maximum effort, and the Bulls need more guys like this. They need guys with that dog-like mentality that is going to get the team energized and feeding off your effort, getting the crowd involved. The Bulls, simply put, did not have guys like this last season. Not until they added Patrick Beverley, and wouldn't you know it, they started playing better once Pat Bev was added. Guys were not being held accountable for their lackluster play, their lackadaisical approach when closing out games, and blowing big lead after big lead. And not only does Torrey Craig actually provide effort and energy on the defensive end like Jevon Carter, he also adds some size for the Bulls. He can play the 3 or 4. Bulls really, for the last 2 years, have only been playing with one true power forward in Patrick Williams, while having guys like Javonte Green and Alex Caruso playing power forward to finally bring in a guy over 6'6", but can also shoot it. He shot nearly 40% from 3 on 3 attempts per game last season. So again, I'm not going to say either Craig or Carter are these lights out sharpshooters, but it's certainly better than what the Bulls were working with last season, and they're going to be getting more opportunities to let those shots fly in the upcoming season when they're on the Bulls. And here's the thing. While yes, these are effectively 2 role players the Bulls added, guys who are most likely going to be coming off the bench. Well, maybe not Carter, but my guess is Craig will be coming off the bench. Yes, they're not game changers. They don't make the Bulls title contenders. And I'm sure some of you are thinking, well, what's the point then? Why delay the inevitable if this just improves the Bulls to being a first-round exit team at best? Well, the one thing I think people aren't considering here, well, first of all, I would much prefer to see my team in the playoffs than going through another 5-year rebuild that might not pan out anyway. But that aside, as bad as the Bulls were last season, finishing the year 40-42, 10th in the East, do you know how many of their 42 losses were decided by 5 points or less? 17 games. The Bulls lost 17 games by 5 points or less last season. 9 of those were decided by 1 possession. And what's the biggest weakness the Bulls had as a team last year? Their lack of 3-point shooting. Dead last in the association in threes attempted and threes made. And it was by a wide margin too. The Bulls were the only team to attempt below 30 threes per game, both this season and last season. It's crazy what making a couple extra threes in a game can do for you. For the Bulls, you're potentially talking about the difference of being a 40-win team versus a 50-win team. And by bringing in 2 players who can knock down threes at a 40% clip on solid volume, 2 players that shot more threes than all the Bulls players not named Zach Lavine, Coby White, and, well, Nikola Vucevic. He took more threes last year than Torrey Craig, but he did not take more than Jevon Carter. But by giving the Bulls those added threes per game, could be the difference maker in the Bulls finishing 4th or 5th in the Eastern Conference versus 10th from where they did last season. It also enables Vuce to focus more on his inside game when they don't need him taking as many threes because no one else will. And Vucevic is just so much more effective in posting up in the paint and playing the pick and roll. So again, I know this isn't a groundbreaking offseason that is going to completely change this team around, and even still the future of this team is questionable with the older roster that is only going to continue to get older, but so far anyway, the moves for which the front office have made have been low-key impressive given the constraints they had to work with and still addressing areas of need. The offseason is not over yet. Bulls still have to fill out the rest of their roster. We'll see what other moves are actually going to come through in the coming days, but let me know what you guys think of the Bulls offseason thus far, and as always, be sure to subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.